Just give us an idea, what's the significance with these particular visits in an African perspective?
You can't talk the African perspective before you talk the bilateral perspective, which is Rwanda, China. And that's very significant because in November this year, it will be marking 47 years since China-Rwanda, bilateral relations actually started on November 12, 1971. So it will be 47 years in November this year. But the interesting thing is that it's only the first time that we are having a Chinese president visit Rwanda. So that's a major landmark, and it tells you that, the relations are just getting deeper, and the president's visit is actually, just symbolizes that we are in this for the long haul. Now, the other significance is the African significance, which is that the President Xi and that of India, they are visiting at a time. They are visiting at a time when, they are visiting at a time when President Paul Kagame is the chairman of the African Union. There's an interesting story going on in China, in Africa, which is the fact that we are trying to integrate the market and be one huge market of around 1.2 billion people. Now, you're talking 1.2 billion people, you're talking 1.4 billion people in China, you're talking 1.3 something billion people of India. This is a big conversation. Now, when you look at China and its African story, it's been on for the longest time, probably dating from the 1970s proper, after China really reestablished itself and opened up its door to the world. But its influence has mainly been seen. The strategy has been influence without dominating, which is the fact that you see a lot of affordable Chinese products, especially electronics, making life easier for most of the Africans, which is why in every African household there is a piece of China. But when you look at the image of the president of China in most minds of Africans, this image is not so strong. So when a Chinese president comes to Africa, they now also put a face of the Chinese leadership to everything Chinese, which is already in their life. And this goes to even the investments that the Chinese have already invested in Africa, which is where the main conversation now is. Because Chinese relations with most of African governments, they are mainly focused on government to government. Now, it's very important for Africans to see themselves in these in these deals.
You're noting there, because at the end of the day, we have lots of memorandums being signed. Now, we know what has been happening with China-Africa relations. Some of the countries, like in Kenya, stories have come out in the recent past, a few weeks or even months. At the end of the day, you want to know, what is Africa getting out of it?
What Africa will get out will be what African negotiators actually take to the table when they face the Chinese. The Chinese are very smart. They are coming to Africa not for charity, but to do business. You heard President Paul Kagame this afternoon saying we look at each other as equal partners. Now, equal partners means what you bring is what I bring. We are equal on the table. But for me, it's kind of, for Africa, it's a bit almost fallacious to say that we are equal to China, given that if you compare what we are getting from China and what China is getting from us, we're borrowing a lot from China. We're getting more investments from China to Africa, but we're not getting a lot of African investments in China vis-a-vis. So the relationship is a bit lopsided. Yeah? So it's very important that when our negotiators go on the table to engage the Chinese, they have to be very smart, look at the African, and look at what exactly they're going to get. Because the diplomats will tell you something else. We are equal partners, blah, 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 blah. But when you actually look at the outcomes, the benefits of the Chinese investments to actual Africans, that's where the conversation is going to start. And I've been doing a bit of research on the perception of most Africans towards Chinese investments. In some African countries, you'll find that there is a bit of rift between the indigenous Africans and the Chinese, because the actual expectations are not actually going down to the civilian Africans that we're talking about.
We actually have someone on Skype, and we'll be moving now to Ibrahim Diong. He's the former Minister of Chinese Affairs, of Senegal to Chinese Affairs. Diong, it's good to speak to you and to have you on the show. I understand that Senegal has now been the first West African nation to commit to China's Belt and Road Initiative, which they've been pushing, you know, to penetrate different markets globally, Asia, Africa, and even Europe. Just give us a sense of understanding how significant this is, not just for Senegal, but also for Francophone Africa, but also putting into context West Africa. Nigeria is such a big market. One would ask, why didn't China actually go to Nigeria to be able to get this West African market?
Well, let me first make a bigger point, which is really we live in a new world where the geopolitics is such that everybody is scratching their head, trying to figure out how you're going to deal with Africa, given what's happening within the US and Russia over the last year and a half. In that situation that we live in, every single country, China included, is trying to position themselves around the world, in Africa in particular, for obvious reason. And that's why the relationship with Africa and China is changing, and rapidly, and no longer driven by commodities and driven by Chinese investments alone, but dealing also with geopolitics, but also in trade and investment and so on. Now, given the fact that in most African countries, as you know, the funding gap to build our infrastructure across the country is about $93 billion annually. So therefore, the China Belt Road kind of initiative is something that's extremely important across the continent in Africa, and Senegal is an exception. And that's why, if you look at today in Senegal, the extension of the toll roads and the road network is widely financed by the Chinese government, but also by Chinese companies building it. And that's why the visit of the Chinese president in Senegal was extremely important to the country, particularly with regard to infrastructure, but more importantly also in positioning Senegal as a destination whereby China could trade with the rest of the world, with the US, with other African countries as well. And that's why the visit was extremely important for Senegal, but also for the region as such. And one of the things you need to also notice, the countries have been chosen for the China visit and not by accident. You know, Senegal plays a major role in the region. Rwanda has a major leadership role in Africa, particularly when it comes to free trade, and South Africa also being a major player. So I think altogether, China is repositioning itself, and to the extent that the relation with Africa will change, it will change rapidly.
I want to touch on the fact that, of course, with the China and the Belt member countries, there comes with a lot of lending to these countries. But in the past, we've seen a lot of controversy, especially when it comes to China lending to its Belt and Road partner. Is that something to worry about in this particular case?
Well, we need to understand that there's a changing landscape of the relationship. It's no longer driven by only public sector actually funding from China to Africa. There's a growing number of private sector Chinese players that are actually investing in the continent, in agribusiness, in the energy sector, in other areas that are equally important for Africa. So I think we need to diversify the relationship. It's not necessarily only driven by concessional financing, which is very limited, but also to get Chinese know-how and technology and private funding be able to come to Africa. And I think one thing I need to caution in making sure when those funding come, they also be done in conjunction with the local private sector, so we can add value to our economies in building capacities, but more importantly, but also making sure we create some local jobs as well. So I think there is a changing nature of the relationship, particularly when it comes to business. And I tend to agree with your guests. I tend to say this: China knows what it wants from Africa. The question is, does Africa knows what it wants from China? And I think for the relationship to be a win-win relationship, we have to make sure as a country, anywhere in Africa, we have a strategy for China. We know what we want. We direct them to sectors that are going to make a difference in our economies. And eventually the relationship over time will grow to be a much more respectful win-win relationship as opposed to a one-sided relationship.
You seem to be agreeing, Ken. Let me bring in Ken in this particular case. You seem to be agreeing with what Diong says in regards to what Africa getting to understand what it needs from China. Doesn't this come back now to the private sector in Africa?
Yeah, like I said, you want to see the public sector moving, you know, in the same strides with the private sector. If Rwanda is making a move for China, can we see the Rwanda private sector also, you know, taking a step? like in this meeting, I haven't seen much of it. Okay, I know that every time a leader comes, members of the private sector are within, the vicinity of these conversations. But I want to see more of their visibility coming in, because that's where, real growth comes in. We are here trying to build a private sector-led economy, and that means you want to see the private sector being at the vanguard of these international relations conversations, especially for, investment and trade. But the other thing I want to add is that the more China gets deeply involved with Africa, the more it gets deeply interested in the stability of Africa. Africa as a continent, countries in particular. Security is a very important issue. Political stability is a very important issue.
I actually want us to get into
which is why when the President Xi is here, it's one of the issues that I'm sure they are going to have a conversation on with the leader of the African Union. How do we stabilize Africa so that we know that these investments are long-term? So if you're going to have long-term investments, you don't want to have short-term political stability. It also has to be long-term. So it's a very important strategic visit, and these leaders are going to be leveling on how do we invest but keep the security and political side of the affairs of Africa actually supporting the investment that we're putting in.
Quite important to note. Let's